Hello. I trust that this recording of a lecture in the course Introduction to Design Studies finds you all well, healthy, and that your friends and families have not been affected by the virus outbreak. As you're well aware by now, we are going on to distance learning. As an exercise before the spring break, we recorded the first of our lectures. I want to do so today with another lecture, this time on scenarios. While the first has a theme, the visual narrative, and was about storytelling, so the voiceover providing a continuous narration, with the scenario, the recording of my voice speaking over the slides and introducing select media fulfills another function. With this lecture, the idea of the scenario makes you aware of the surroundings for this presentation. We've asked you as an exercise to please send to your recitation group leaders a very brief scenario over this week about your own new study environments, which undoubtedly have changed and have been modified. In order to show you what we intended with this idea of a scenario, I want to show you a couple of examples, if I may. This will constitute, to a certain extent, the prologue to this lecture. So here are two scenarios. Let me read to you the first one, which is very much like a story. A space with red desks and some green and orange chairs, a window, some bookshelves, a small grey lamp, and two pictures, pink and white, on the wall. Person 1, dressed in jeans, t-shirt, sneakers, sitting behind the desk typing. He asks himself, by the way, he's quite ponderous and pretentious, so bear with me. He asks himself, what is the value of human interaction? You learn from texts and images as much as from speech. What is the respective value for transmitting knowledge through written words compared to the spoken ones? He gets up and moves around the room to a set of shelves with a water kettle and mugs. He makes himself a cup of tea. He asks himself further, do we need to vary forms of instructions? Is the combination of different forms required to stimulate cognition, that is, how we acquire and process information through thought, experiences, and the senses? He takes his mug of tea to his desk and blows on the surface of the liquid. Small ripples move across the surface and steam is pushed away from his mouth to the edge of the mug. By value, do we mean, for instance, expedience? How effective is the transmission of knowledge? Or do we mean economic value? Do you get the access and amount of information that you pay for? Or, indeed, do we mean the quality, i.e. how accurate or stimulating or original is the data in its presentation? What do we mean by value of information and the value of transmission? He takes a sip of tea and burns the tip of his tongue. There's a knock on the door. He gets up and opens the door to find a colleague from building management, whom he knows well. They smile at each other, somewhat apologetically. Person 1. Buenas tardes, Alejandro. How are you doing? Person 2, dressed in blue dickies, black shoes, and a light blue shirt with the new school embroidered in red. Buenas tardes. All good here. But do you know we're closing down the school at 3 p.m. today? Person 1. Closing for good, right? Sorry, I forgot the time. I'll pack them and come down. Person 2. No problem. I'll check the other offices and see you in the lobby in 10. He departs with a wave of the hand. Person 1. Thank you. He tries to finish his scalding hot tea, but ends up pouring half of it in the sink in the studio next door. He washes out the mug and looks around the room. What is the role of space in the transmission of information? By space, do I mean principally the real or virtual distance that information needs to travel from sender to receiver? Or am I thinking of space as a designed environment that stimulates or restricts the acquiring and processing of knowledge? See cognition above. He gathers his bag and rummages on the shelves for some books. What about the tables, chairs, pictures, and the lamp? What about the kettle and the mugs? Are they all instrumental for generating and sending information? Or are they merely an assemblage of independent objects with some creature comfort, hot tea and so, but essentially incidental, and they have little bearing on how knowledge is transmitted? He locks the door and walks down the staircase. He doesn't like elevators and prefers the warmth of the stairwell with the old red steam pipes running up and down its entire height. On the way down, he glances at the graffiti and the old posters announcing lectures and workshops that now have all been cancelled. I guess now the most relevant space is created in communication and information design to maintain data flow and ready access. He says goodbye to Alejandro and Rafael, who are chatting by the security desk, and he exits the building. A quick glance left and right reveals near-empty streets that previously had been teeming with students moving from building to building. So this is a short scenario about the importance or lack of importance of space in which we find ourselves when we are giving out information as instructors or as readers, as speakers, and when we're receiving information as professors in tutorials, as students, as colleagues. And with the scenario that undoubtedly has changed for your study experience comes maybe a different way of acquiring knowledge. But of course, talking about creativity, scenarios can be fun experiments for the future. And indeed, this is very particular to scenarios, as you will see later in the presentation. So here's a second scenario, a storyboard for an office design of the future, somewhat whimsical, And it's imagined originally by the French comic book artist Yves Chalon in his story Les Robots c'est Rebif, The Robots Rebel, from 1982. And this appears initially in the panels in the storyline of a comic book, was later actually realized, as you will see. So here's illustration 1. The final panel from The Robots Rebel. And the robot that is bringing all the work is saying, "Let's get to work, boss. You have to make up a lot of time." So the desk you see here in the final panel from 1982 was actually created as a small resin sculpture, about 8.5 inches in height, in 2011, by a designer called Leblanc Delienne, who specializes in pop art furniture and works mainly with resin, polymer resin, coated, and so on and so forth. And he often takes his cues from animation and comic books. So here's another view of Adolphus Klein in the office scene. Here imagined in a comic book store, I think, in France, with a little poster of Adolphus Klein, the character by Yves Chalon's comic, in the background. And here's a close-up. Now, to realize this as a little resin plastic sculpture is one thing. But to then realize it as an actual desk, to recreate this fictional two-dimensional desk of the office future of 2000 226 in the year 2226. Now, in January 2011, as an actual desk made from polymer resin over a wooden carcass and presented at the annual Maison et Objet design fair in Paris, is another matter. So Leblanc d'Alien takes the 2 dimensions of the panel of the comic book and blows it up many years later as an actual piece of furniture. And it is not, I would argue, the simple transition from 2D to 3D that brings this scenario into different contexts, but it's the fact that after so many years, what looked futuristic in 1982 in the comic now looks quite like a humdrum office desk in 2011 and can actually be exhibited in a furniture fair without anybody batting an eyelid. Here's a bit on the technique. Here's a photo from Studio Leblanc d'Alien outside Paris, where they're using sandpaper to finish the resin after this rotation molding. So this is a question of design, the construction of furniture, product design. But initially, of course, it was the visual narrative of a comic. And here is a comic book fan and aficionado sitting behind the desk, reenacting the scenario that originally was done by a fictional character, Adolphus Clar, in a comic from 1982. So it's not so much reality imitating art, but it is the actual live reenactment of a scenario. And this is quite important for the usage of scenarios in design, as we will see. So much to the prologue. Now to the main part. I would like to invite you to watch the following video. Please click on the link, on the YouTube link below. It comes from a tribe called Quest, and it's a song called Scenario from 1991. As you will see, the director, Jim Swarfield, is using a very particular technique to present not just the song, but the actual production of the song. And as you will now no doubt see, the particular editing software that was developed for the early Mac in 1991 is used not simply as a tool, but as the graphic interface of the video. So the scenario is shown both in its final representation, but also, one could argue, in its production. And that, of course, is instrumental, as we've discussed many times, for Introduction to Design Studies, that we're not just dealing with representation and final design, that we're very interested in the processes. And here you see the process used as a creative interface, as a visual creative interface that generates a narrative. So, have a listen, have a look, and come back to the presentation when you're done. Enjoy. So, after listening to this introduction, both the prologue and the first music video, let's define together the scenario. I'm offering you a few definitions below, and I'm reading them out to you, but please reflect critically on them and consider your own definition when you go through the little homework that we set, but also to later reflect on the significance of scenarios for design processes. So, a scenario, most widely, can be a written outline of a movie, a novel, a stage work, that gives details of the plot and the individual scenes. Imagine scenarios for short stories. It's a formal diegesis. Walt wrote scenarios for major Hollywood studios. It's a postulated sequence or development of events. A possible scenario is that he was attacked after opening the front door. Or a scenario is a setting, in particular for a work of art, of literature. The scenario is the French Revolution. So these are scenarios that are confined to culture, to design, to art, but they are more general, formal devices. And of course, you saw this weird word, diegesis, which I would like to explain a bit further. It's defined as the presentation of a narrative without dramatic imitation of the events, scenes, or characters described. So it's not an imitation, it's something that is formalized, it's artistic, it's aesthetic to a certain extent. So diegesis is the world as depicted in narrative art, especially in a film. So it's a fiction in a way, but it's not a fiction in that it falsifies or imitates. It's a fiction that is generative. It produces something new. And in design, we often discuss this, and we had one of our students saying this at the very beginning in a very, very poignant way. Design is an original interpretation of reality. So the scenario is an original presentation of a reality that could exist, that you can imagine as a dialogue, as a series of movement, as a narrative, as a visual narrative, which occupies the real world, but also changes it. So here important is the distinction between mimesis, the imitation of things, and diegesis. That can be seen as between showing and telling, between iconic and didactical science on the one hand, and symbolic science on the other, between drama and recitation. So mimesis, of course, is you trying to imitate something, you're trying to get close to something that exists in reality, while striving within an artificial form to somehow reflect it. But most of the time, mimesis will be recognized as such. It's an imitation, you know? It can be a very interesting imitation, but it's an imitation nonetheless. Diegesis does not make that claim. It doesn't say I'm imitating. It says from the beginning, I am inventing, fictionalizing, dramatizing something new that didn't exist before, or existed in some form, but not in the form in which I am imagining it. So the scenario has a certain originality, artistic and formalistic, and maybe structural originality to it. But there are also commercial applications. For example, here is the Shell scenarios. These are sociological, ethnographic, anthropological studies commissioned by the Anglo-Dutch oil company. And they often concern young people, and they concern childhood, young adult development in order to predict future scenarios in which energy, you know, the creation of energy, the distribution of energy, the consumption of energy plays an obvious role because it's an oil company. But these scenarios are given a sheen of scientific inquiry, of rational value. They seem to be about statistics and data. And that, of course, is also an element of the scenario. The scenario doesn't have to be a dramatic fiction. It can also be a fiction that's based on real-life data. It's a forward projection of data that is available, information that is available now. How might that develop in the future? So that's also an important element of the scenario, the data-driven projection or prediction. So while design often needs a kind of filter to offer a solution, an artistic filter, a formal filter, a media filter, when you put the scenario in, you come back, in my view, to this important element of development, where design is not simply something that leads through a very well-rehearsed process to an economical solution, but that design has a speculative element in it. And the scenario is very much part of the speculative character. It's about developments. It's about working design and representation. It's about thinking through a possible narrative, inventing a narrative in order to help you develop a design in the first place. So what appears as design by a filter for solution, in the scenario, that the scenario sets a scene for the design to lead to its development. Allow me to explain. Two futuristic scenarios, sci-fi scenarios, so to speak. One, the Star Trek communicative, and here you see something from an original Star Trek episode from 1964. And below that, the design interface for Minority Report, a film from 2002. So here the idea is that fictional scenarios, the script for both the Star Trek and for Minority Report, somehow anticipate and act as a forum for experimentation that later prompts designers to look at these fictional scenarios and try and realize in their design work the objects or environments or spaces that are presented to them. So for the Star Trek communicator, you have the flip-up Motorola Razr from 2004, where what was a communication design that was presented as a fiction in 1964, a forward-looking sci-fi fiction, but could not be realized technologically or materially at that time, comes many, many years later, in fact, 40 years later, into production by a designer who might or might not have considered these scenarios as viable future offerings and thinking, okay, if they're communicating in that way, what object do I need to design to emulate that form of communication? And I have to go back here. Tom Cruise starts as the fictional detective in Minority Report, tries to gather data and information on this huge virtual screen that is put as a transparent panorama in front of him. People were thinking, wow, this is a vision of the future that seems both formally, technologically, and in terms of narrative, very appealing. You gather information, you visualize it, and you put it together in an assemblage. And through this, you generate certain solutions. In this case, of course, the detective can find the objects of his interest, not necessarily the victims in the narratives, but the kind of objects of his inquiry. So when Minority Report came out in 2002, people were phoning up or contacting the software company that had provided some of the digital images that were used in Minority Report. And they basically went to them and say, can you do me a screen like that? And the obvious response from the software company was, no, this is a fiction. We are nowhere near this. You realize this is a science fiction film, and technologically, this cannot be done. Appealing as it looks on a visual surface, technologically, it's not quite there. But this idea takes hold, and you can see here's a Microsoft prototype, the HoloLens from 2016, which has never really made it into production and looks a bit awkward because you need these rather unfashionable glasses to put on. But it imagines, as you can see from the illustration on the right, it imagines a similar scenario as Tom Cruise is exercising it in Minority Report by being able to virtually point at certain data and even grab them and move them in order to combine them into folders, into narratives, into sequences. So the element of the story act in a way as design tools. Because they're futuristic or speculative, they present atypical situations and exceptions to the norm, and that is very provocative and productive for a designer, because they might think, oh, wow, I haven't seen this before. So how can I develop within these scenarios that are given to me, that I'm inventing, how can I invent objects or make objects, develop objects, prototype objects that can help me to illustrate this scenario, or in fact act within that scenario, can be objects within the scenario that actually propel the story forward and make interaction between people possible. So scenarios in a way are prototypical situations, and as we all know from design how important prototyping is, that is equally the role for a scenario. So science fact becomes design fiction, becomes science fiction. And the design fiction, because it's speculative, might be something that looks out of this world or out of place at a given time, but somewhere in the future will, through the cultural impact that this science fiction has become an ordinary object, service, system to use. Indeed, there's a library, a big, extensive, multilingual library in Germany that uses this for commercial purposes. It offers a repository of science fiction scenarios that designers can access for a fee. They can go to them and say, listen, I am thinking about medical instruments. Can you please give me all the links you have to science fictions that feature a particular medical instrument, let's say a ventilation apparatus? And this library will, through keywords, collate all the narratives, all the visual narratives, all the written narratives. They can be films, they can be audio files, they can be books, they can be comic books. They gather all these that pertain to a certain keyword, in this case, ventilators, medical ventilators, and they will send them to the designer. And the scenarios that are presented in these science fictions might give certain environments, spatially, but also sequentially, for the designer to ponder and think, oh, if I were to design a medical ventilator for the future that is forward-looking and progressive, these are the scenarios I need to keep in mind in adapting them. Another more concrete example, perhaps, is something that comes from the Apple Navigator ad, which was produced in 1987 by the design teams at Apple for their CEO at that time for a keynote presentation. It was not meant to go public, but it was meant to show the company and shareholders and invited audience where the company was going to go. And please watch this, enjoy it for the portentous and pretentious instructor, professor, college professor, university professor that was in my very first scenario, the person that was sitting in the office. In the same way, you could argue that this professor is a portentous, pretentious fool who is using technology in order to get out of work. But this is only the part of the narrative that might resonate with me more than it resonates with you. What I wanted for you to look at, please, is the fact that this navigator, as you know from your handheld devices like mobile phones and tablets, is already predicting in 1987 certain functions through a visual narrative and through a storyline of a film. So imagine 1987, this was a forward-looking scenario, and then maybe check how many of these ideas that was produced through this narrative have actually come to pass now. And since we're dealing with these recorded lectures in e-learning and e-teaching, this probably has now acquired an additional resonance and relevance because it deals with the digital interaction between a professor, a researcher, a colleague, and the students. So enjoy this short advert, and then please come back to the presentation. So here's a quote from John M. Carroll from a scenario-based design essay that he published with MIT Press in 2000. And I quote from this: "Scenarios highlight goals suggested by the appearance and behavior of the system. What people try to do with the system. What procedures are adopted, not adopted, carried out successfully or erroneously, making mistakes. And what interpretations people make of what happens to them. If the accountant scenario is typical of what people want to do, it substantially constrains design approaches to window management and switching." So the first bit is a repeated definition of the scenario, and the second one is about restriction and limitation. So an accountant scenario, assuming, is the idea that designs have to present solutions, have to present accountable economic ideas that somehow turn a profit rather than being engaged in creative work. So scenarios are not just visual narratives or textual narratives or audio narratives for films or other productions. Scenarios also, on a larger scale, describe systems in which a designer, a consumer, a distributor, a user might find herself, himself, or themselves. So scenarios talk about systems. If they're cleverly developed, they can tell you an entire space, an entire social, formal, structural space in which design solution can exist. And indeed, if they are forward-looking, progressive systems, these scenarios might be something that can help further human development. Conversely, if the scenarios are progressive, but the social development has lagged behind as of yet in the mind of the designer, she, he, or they might say, well, these scenarios give us an ideal system in which ideal design projects should exist in order to support the system, to be able to develop it further, and so on and so forth. So scenarios can also involve a very important element of system thinking, which, as you all know, is crucial for many forms of design. So the elements of a scenario, very concretely, is the setting, the space, the environment. It has agents or actors. It has a plot, a storyline, actions and event. They can be linear, non-linear narratives. Sometimes they can jump back into the past or go forward into the future, or they can be sequential and tell a very simple story, as I did with my scenario 1. Well, scenario 2 could be argued was a bit more non-linear because it was about material realizations that happened over a longer period of time. The elements of the scenario, especially for design, also include a prototype, a physical or virtual prototype. And they include some form of representation, not simply of the entire plot and the actors, but also a certain style of representation. So scenarios are also influenced by the way in which you're telling the story. That seems obvious, but can be quite important. The more experimental you are with the representation of something, the more experimental, non-linear, remixed, edited your scenario might be. There's a little side here which I would like you to ponder, and as you see this as a recording, it's something that you might want to read at your own leisure. I'm not going to read you the entire quote from this encyclopedia, but as a method for those of you who are interested in these things, methodologies involving them in your research, in your formulation, there is a certain theory that is called the actor network theory, ANT. That was pioneered in sociology, but now plays a very important role in the history of technology and the critical assessment of technology, mainly through a French theoretician called Bruno Latour, who spoke many, many times at the New School over the past 2 decades, somebody who is very influential in thinking structurally about climate change, for example. But he comes initially from a sociology of technology. And he developed together with Michel Callan and John Law the actor network theory, where he's thinking about agents and actors within systems, but at the same time the objects that they bring. So an early example, for example, was the study of fishermen in the Normandy. Not just the act of fishing, the objects, the transport, all of that they needed, but also the interaction of actors, and not just the fishers themselves, but also the fishermen themselves, but also their environment, their families, their wives, the auxiliary workers that were staying back in the harbor in order to process the catch that would come in with the fishermen on the boat. So it was a very complex system of interaction that was investigated and researched in detail, and by Callan, Law, and Bruno Latour. And out of this came a method that was called actor network theory. For scenario, it's important because from the beginning, it involved the interaction of objects and subjects, which is very dear to design, but very important also for giving value to the material form of cognition. If you invent something, whether it's virtual or real, materially concrete, it is interesting to have it manifest in some form. And for that, the actor network theory offers a very complex system where you have the people who are using things that have been invented or are inventing the things themselves, and through the use of these objects, interact in particular forms with networks. So that just as a methodological aside, if you feel like it, read the explanation encyclopedia and look it up. It might be something that could come in handy in the future. So reflection and action within the scenario leads to an evaluation. John Carroll, in Making Use, says scenarios are work-orientated designed objects. So this is interesting to me because it elevates the scenario from an aid to visual narratives, from a formal system in which you tell a story, to something that is in itself very creatively. So when I talked earlier about that the representation of the scenario very much influences the way in which the scenario is structured, that points at the way in which you can be creative with the idea of a scenario. You can work through contrast, static and fluid, concrete or flexible. You can develop a storyboard where you, as very simple icons and symbols, you go through a series of actions, the assemblage of an electronic chair, for example, or the idea of the need of innovation for a visual and audio warning when cycling. So the form that you use in order to develop your scenario should be in a way congenial to the type of system, the type of service, the type of object you might want to represent. So in order to create a scenario, and you can experiment with this, we would invite you to do so in this small exercise for this week, think about the relevant data as input. And data doesn't have to be something purely scientific or rational. What you're putting in, what are the people, the system, the objects that you want to have in your scenario? What is the purpose of it? Do you want to tell a story? Do you want to try something out in which an object interacts with a user? Do you want to investigate a system? And so on and so forth. Combine formal and structural elements like setting, we mentioned these before, agents and actors, goals and objectives, action and events, possible errors, always interesting because it twists and subverts ideas. That can be very creative. And think about exceptions to the scenario. What is not part of a scenario or what is misplaced in a scenario. These might become very important. Think about the narrative structure, as we mentioned. It could be linear, it could be non-linear. Consider the viewpoint, who is telling the story. These can change. You can start from, we had weird experiment in modification or second thought, that short story that we were reading a few weeks ago, where it was all the second person singular. But that's an artificial experiment and doesn't need to be consistent. You can switch between different viewpoints for a scenario. What's the relation to reality? We talked about this. Is it forward-looking? Is it reflecting very concretely what's happening now? Or is it envisaging something or going back in the past and reconstructing something that seems relevant for the system, the service, and the object that you're interested in? What is the media that you're using? I gave examples from maybe a very simple text or a comic book or furniture design, but it can be anything else that takes your fancy and is relevant for your own design practice. To summarize again, the purpose of a scenario. Illustrate a system evaluate the system's functionality, consider design attributes and features, and test the theory. Now, these are 4 very simple points, but when you look at them, they become incredibly complex. It almost encompasses anything you can think about in design development, formalized as a narrative, as a storyboard, as a mood board, as some form of media that sets a scene for something. To illustrate a system means to think very generically, to really think about networks in a very complex manner. To evaluate the system's functionality can be a highly critical, political, or socially relevant exercise. Think of our present situation, the way in which health services deal with viruses. What is a system that is put in place there? What is a triage, for example? Who gets treated first, who gets treated second, who gets treated third? These are really important systemic questions. And of course, scenarios help a lot to deal with this. New York City, indeed, in 2008, had a scenario of such a virus outbreak. And I dare say, I don't have the details at hand, but I dare say that a lot of the findings that were done today, in 2008, will be used today, or unfortunately might have become irrelevant or erroneous, faulty, mistaken in today's situation. But in 2008, they played through a scenario, they tested it out with a network of health workers, institutions, designed objects like transportation, ventilation machines, and so on and so forth, in order to see how the different parts of the system would interact and what design solution need to be offered for the system to work more efficiently. So very important 2008, this scenario. I very much hope that it helped with the way in which New York City deals with the virus today, and hopefully that can be communicated to other communities as well. Design, as offering solutions and ideas, plays an important role here. And it tests a theory, because not all scenarios have to be concretely about a real situation. They don't all have to be about the spread of the virus. They can be a highly creative, speculative measure that looks far in the future and thinks more broadly about relationships between people and nature and so on and so forth. Many different examples can be imagined. So scenarios can also be extremely speculative and forward-looking. So think about the purposes of scenario. If you feel like it, go back to certain slides of the presentation and look at the components and elements of a scenario, and then have a bit of fun with describing either your own environment in which your future learning for the next few weeks will have to happen. Your e-learning, your distance learning. And if you feel like it, speculate about ideal solutions in the future in which e-learning can be modified through designed intervention and probably made more efficient. So, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you're safe and healthy, and I'll see you next week with another lecture. Please take the idea of the scenario seriously. Don't be bogged down simply by the idea that it is a task, but that it is something where the present situation, as dramatic and sad as it is, might offer in a very, very small way the potential for you as a creative designer to look at this and think, okay, how can I describe this? How can I make this into a visual or textual narrative? And to a certain extent, be creative with it, be productive with it, not just be a victim of the circumstances, but being proactive and saying, okay, I'm describing it, I'm analyzing it. Maybe I can even put forward ideas about communication that we might interact. So thank you again, and I will speak to you next week. Bye-bye.